The Reconstruction Era. 21.1 Introduction. By the end of the Civil War, Americans longed for peace. But what kind of peace? One that punished the South for its rebellion, a peace that helped rebuild the devastated region, a peace that helped the 4 million African Americans freed from slavery become full and equal citizens? In his inaugural address delivered in 1865, President Abraham Lincoln spoke of healing peace. With malice or hatred toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish, hold dear, a just and lasting peace. The nation would never know how Lincoln planned to achieve such a peace. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after the war ended, the president was assassinated while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. His murderer was an actor named John Wilkes Booth. Booth thought that killing Lincoln would somehow save the Confederacy. With Lincoln dead, the task of healing the nation's wounds fell to President Andrew Johnson. Reconstruction, or rebuilding the South and bringing the southern states back into the Union, would not be easy. For while the nation was united again, Americans remained deeply divided. As you read about how Reconstruction was carried out, think about Lincoln's dream of a just and lasting peace. Did the end of the war and of slavery lead to a peace based on liberty and justice for all? Or was Reconstruction just the first stage in a long and difficult struggle for equal rights for all Americans? (23.2) Presidential Reconstruction. As the Civil War ended, people in the United States had sharply different views on how to treat the defeated Confederacy. For President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner from Tennessee, Reconstruction had two main aims. First, Southern states had to create new governments that were loyal to the Union and that respected federal authority. Second, slavery had to be abolished once and for all. These goals left many issues to be resolved. For example, who would control the new state governments in the South? Former rebels? Would the freed slave have the same equal rights as citizens? And what would the relationships be between freed slaves and their former masters? Many Republicans in Congress believed that strong measures would be needed to settle these issues. To them, Reconstruction meant nothing less than a complete remaking of the South based on equal rights and a free labor economy. The stage was set for a battle over the control and even the meaning of Reconstruction. President Johnson's Reconstruction Plan. In May 1865, President Johnson announced his Reconstruction Plan. A former Confederate state could rejoin the Union once it had written a new state constitution, elected a new state government, repealed its act of secession, canceled its war debts, and ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. By the fall of 1865, every Southern state had met the president's requirements, and the 13th Amendment became part of the Constitution. Presidential Reconstruction had begun. The Freedmen's Bureau. For former slaves called freedmen, the freedom guaranteed by the 13th Amendment had brought problems as well as opportunities. As Frederick Douglass wrote, the freedman was free from the individual master, but a slave of society. He had neither money, nor property, nor friends. He was free from the old plantation, but he had nothing but the dusty road under his feet. He was turned loose, naked, hungry, and destitute to the open sky. To assist former slaves, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau in March 1865. Over the next 4 years, the Bureau provided food and medical care to both blacks and whites in the South. It helped freedmen bargain for wages and good working conditions. It also distributed some land in 40-acre plots to loyal refugees and freedmen. Resentful whites, however, attacked the Bureau as an example of Northern interference in the South. Ultimately, the hope of many freedmen for 40 acres and a mule died when Congress refused to take land away from Southern whites. The most lasting benefit of the Freedmen's Bureau was in education. Thousands of former slaves, both young and old, flocked to free public schools built by the Bureau. Long after the Bureau was gone, such institutions as Howard University in Washington, D.C. continued to provide educational opportunity for African Americans. The Black Codes. As new state governments took power in the South, many Republicans in Congress were alarmed to see that they were headed by the same people who had led the South before the war. Wealthy white planters. Once in office, these leaders began passing laws known as Black Codes to control their former slaves. The Black Codes served three purposes. The first was to limit the right to freedom. Generally, former slaves were given the right to marry, to own property, to work for wages, and to sue in court, but other rights for citizenship were denied them. Blacks, for example, could not vote or serve on juries in the South. The second purpose of the Black Codes was to help planters find workers to replace their slaves. The codes required freedmen to work. Those without jobs could be arrested and hired out to the planters. The codes also limited freedmen to farm work or jobs requiring few skills. African Americans could not enter many trades or start businesses. The third purpose of the Black Codes was to keep freedmen at the bottom of the social order in the South. Most Black Codes called for segregation of blacks and whites in public spaces. Black children were not allowed to attend public schools. A Louisiana lawmaker defended this ban by saying that it made no sense to spend tax money to educate any but the superior man of the white race. 23.3 Congressional Reconstruction. As 1865 came to a close, President Johnson announced that Reconstruction was over. The Southern states were ready to rejoin the Union. Republican leaders in Congress did not agree. These lawmakers believed that the South would not be reconstructed until freedmen were guaranteed full rights of citizenship. The following year, Congress enacted two bills designed to help freedmen. The first extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. The second was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It struck at the Black Codes by declaring freedmen to be full citizens with the same rights as whites. Johnson declared both bills unconstitutional and vetoed them. An angry Congress overrode his vetoes. The 14th Amendment. To further protect the rights of African Americans, Congress approved the 14th Amendment. This amendment declared former slaves to be citizens with full civil rights. No state, it said, shall deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. This meant that the state governments could not treat some citizens as less equal than others. President Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment and called on voters to throw Republican lawmakers out of office. Instead, Republican candidates won a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress in 1866 election. From that point on, Congress controlled Reconstruction. Military Reconstruction Act. Early in 1867, the new Congress passed its own Military Reconstruction Act. Once again, it did so over Johnson's veto. This plan divided the South into 5 military districts, each governed by a general who had backed by federal troops. The state governments set up under Johnson's Reconstruction Plan were declared illegal. New governments were to be formed by Southerners loyal to the United States, both black and white. Southerners who had supported the Confederacy were denied the right to vote. Lawmakers also passed 2 acts designed to reduce Johnson's power to interfere with congressional reconstruction. The Command of the Army Act limited his power over the Army. The Tenure of Office Act barred him from firing certain federal officials without the Senate's consent. President Johnson blasted both laws as unconstitutional. Then, to prove his point, he fired one of the officials protected under the Tenure of Office Act. The impeachment of Johnson. The House of Representatives responded to Johnson's challenge by voting to impeach the president. Besides violating the Tenure of Office Act, Johnson was charged with bringing the high office of the President of the United States into contempt, ridicule, and disgrace to the scandal of the good citizens. During his trial in the Senate, the president's lawyers argued that Johnson's only crime had been to oppose Congress. If he were removed from office for that reason, they warned, no future president will be safe, who happens to differ with a majority of the House and Senate. 2/3 of the Senate had to find the president guilty in order to remove him from office. Despite very heavy pressure to convict him, 7 Republicans and 12 Democrats voted not guilty. Johnson escaped removal from office by 1 vote, but his power was broken. Sharecropping. While Congress and the president battled over Reconstruction, African Americans in the South struggled to build new lives. Most former slaves desperately wanted land to farm, but had no money to buy it. Meanwhile, their former owners desperately needed workers to farm their land, but had no money to pay them. Out of the needs of both groups came a farming system called sharecropping. Planters who turned to sharecropping divided their land into small plots. They rented these plots to individual tenant farmers who pay rent for the land they work. A few tenants paid the rent for their plots in cash, but most paid their rent by giving the landowner a share, usually 1/3 or 1/2 of the crops they raised on their plots. Sharecropping looked promising to freedmen at first. They liked being independent farmers who worked for themselves. In time, they hoped to earn enough money to buy a farm of their own. However, most sharecroppers had to borrow money from planters to buy food, seeds, tools, and supplies they needed to survive until harvest time. Few ever earned enough for their crops to pay back what they owed. Rather than leading to independence, sharecropping usually led to a lifetime of poverty and debt.